Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost in Agreement. Almost in Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostinagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, information, politics, government, business, education, really whatever gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com. Joined remotely this week, or I guess I'm the one joining remotely this week, with Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott, back there in Knoxville?
Oh, I am holding down the fort as best I can. I hope you're enjoying yourself in parts unknown. So
I am. I'm back in the Crescent City, New Orleans, one of the greatest places in the world, in my opinion. And yes, looking forward to having a nice weekend here, the French Quarter Festival and various other things going on. But before I get to go do all that, I have to talk about Knoxville some more. And that's what we're here to do. I shouldn't say have to. I'm privileged. I'm privileged to talk about Knoxville wherever I go, even in New Orleans.
You can't escape Knoxville. That's the one thing right about it.
There's that old Scott Miller song, you can't shake Knoxville. Mm-hmm. We did have some news and events to talk about this week. We have an interview coming up with the Reverend Dr. Jacquelyn Bragg, who's co-president of Justice Knox, the really interesting and honestly quite effective social justice advocacy group made up of local church congregations. We will talk about them a little bit and talk to Reverend Bragg about that. State legislature, of course, still in the news this week. They are winding down their session, and now is the time of year when they actually start passing some of the bills that they've been talking about the last few months. There are two in particular we're going to talk about, including one that could allow teachers and cafeteria workers and custodians to go armed in public schools. Speaking of schools, we'll talk about Knox County Schools' tentative proposed budget for the coming year. A couple interesting items in there. And Scott, to start us off for the, I guess, third week in a row, we are once again going to talk about the Town of Farragut Board of Mayor and Aldermen and their evolving position on the Knox County Growth Policy Plan. We talked about 2 weeks ago, they rejected that plan. And then last week, they came back and said, well, maybe we want to reconsider that. Basically, one of the five board members had changed his mind, which is going to affect that 3-2 vote. And so they were back in action again this past Thursday. You were there. What did the Farragut board do?
Well, it wasn't as dramatic last night as it was the previous, or I should say last Thursday, since this.
It was in fact last night. We were taping this on Friday.
In fact, yes. As far as when we're taping, but as far as when people are hearing it, it was last Thursday. Anyway, it wasn't as dramatic as it was the previous 2 weeks. There wasn't the surprise vote to reject the plan, and then there wasn't a dramatic turn of events, a changed vote. There was, this previous week, it was really quite calm and sedate out in Farragut. on Thursday. So
nobody stormed out of the meeting this time, apparently.
No one stormed out of the meeting. There was no shouting. There was no yelling. It was all very civil. There were a couple of sharp comments here and there, but for the most part, it was fairly civil. Most of the discussion actually centered on procedural matters about whether the previous week's vote, which there was a special called meeting that the state growth plan law requires if a body rejects the growth plan, they require a meeting for board members to explain themselves why they are rejecting it. Kind of a formal public thing. And so when Farragut did that, but then it was also when the vote changed dramatically, and Scott Meyer, one of the aldermen, switched sides and decided to support the plan, which gave it a 3-2 majority on the 5-member panel, and the talk on Thursday night was whether it was even legal for them to then set the agenda for this meeting at that meeting, and it was very legal, kind of arcane for public forum session. There were basically Tom Hale, the town attorney, said it was legal, and really even if it was improperly voted on the previous meeting, that the town administrator is the one who sets the agenda, not really a vote of city council of the board of mayor and aldermen. So everything was okay, but they took a long time to get there. They really spent a lot of time talking about that. It was mostly seemed like a foregone conclusion.
The technicalities of who specifically sets the Farragut Board of Mayor and Alderman agenda is the kind of minutia that this growth policy plan forces everybody into, because the growth policy plan itself is a very technical document. It's established by state law that has all of these requirements. And so as all of our local bodies work through it, I guess it's no surprise that we consistently end up in the weeds of proper parliamentary procedure and everything else. But the net result of all of that is that Farragut has now voted, along with Knox County Commission and Knoxville City Council, who already approved this plan, to give their blessing to the changes to the county growth plan proposed by County Mayor Glenn Jacobs, which now sets the table for the county to move forward with updating the rest of its planning apparatus, the comprehensive land use plan, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, because county commission is considering that. And then eventually in the future, though they will be redoing the entire zoning ordinance for the county. But this was the thing that had to happen first, basically.
Yeah. This was as you said, setting the table, and this has been kind of the outgrowth of the 2-year advanced Knox planning process, a lot of public input and all that stuff in there. And I would anticipate that once the county commission approves the comprehensive land use plan, which I don't know, I don't know how foolish I am to assume that they will, but
we're not assuming anything.
But if they pass it, then you're talking about getting in the weeds, then the redoing the zoning and development code is going to be really getting in the weeds, because that is where they really determine what you can do on and what zones are established. So.
Yep. Yeah, and no doubt there will be continued, because, of course, as we talked about, even beyond the Farragut board's votes, the changes to the growth plan have been somewhat controversial. There's been a lot of outspoken public opposition, or at least skepticism about them, concerns about allowing more intensity of development in some currently rural areas, what all of that's going to do to our infrastructure, and particularly our roads and our traffic. And I would anticipate that a lot of those conversations are going to carry over to the discussions of the land use plan, and then over the next couple of years, the development of county zoning ordinance and so forth. And so I think we are, although this is a major step and politically a pretty big victory for Jacobs after having been dealt a setback a few weeks ago by the Farragut board, we still have a long way to go in this process, and I think we can anticipate continued public engagement and questions from a lot of the people who have been involved so far.
Oh yeah, it's anytime you deal with land use and what goes on in your neighborhood, and people get passionate about it. They will argue about it. They will come out to public meetings. We see that over and over again when there's a development down the road from a subdivision. That subdivision's homeowners association will show up and and talk about it. So there's going to be a lot of political and community discussion about this as it moves forward, and inevitably, at the end of it, a year or two from now, people will say, "Well, they're rushing this through."
We need more time, right?
I will boldly make that prediction.
I think that is a safe one. But of course, we will continue to cover all of this as it evolves, because the minutia of land use planning is one of those things we are here to talk about and pay attention to, and hopefully try to make a little clearer to folks. All right. We had an interesting presentation this past week by Knox County Schools Superintendent John Ryswick and his staff. They held their annual community budget meeting, which they do every year to kind of roll out their projected budget for the coming fiscal year. And in some ways, this presentation didn't have any big surprises in it, because we had heard ahead of time that, first of all, after having a historic largest one-year funding increase in history last year, thanks to Governor Bill Lee's new education funding formula, that was going to kind of level out this year. We weren't going to see any. There's a 26% increase in state funding last year, which typically runs more in the 3 to 4% range. So that was a huge jump as part of the new TISA state funding formula. Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement is what TISA stands for. And so this year, that state increase is projected to be more about 4.8%, around a 5% bump. Still a pretty decent increase by historic standards, but nothing like the jump they got last year, of course. And so cumulatively, the current year's total budget for the school system is right at $660 million. Currently, the system is anticipating an total increase in funding, including both state funds and local funds. And just to break that out a little bit, state funding accounts for just about half, just under half, 48% of Knox County Schools funding, and local funding makes up most of the rest, about 51% in local property and sales taxes. And so they're expecting that combined total increase to be about 23 million. So we're going to go from about $660 million dollar budget to about a $683.7 million budget. And so that's a $23 million increase in revenue that they're anticipating. We have talked about that they adopted a new salary schedule the other week that is going to give increases to just about everybody who works for the school system, and substantial increases to some people, kind of depending on where on the salary schedule they fall. And that by itself is going to require an extra $39 million in salaries plus another $2 million in benefits. So about a $41 million increase, 1 year increase in salary and benefits, which Ryswick said is the largest jump in that in district history, in terms of, if you just look at a 1 year jump in investment in people, as he called it, this is the biggest one they've made. And they have some other new funding items in there too, some new teachers, English language learner teachers. They're adding 47 of those because of a jump in demand from students who are not, for whom English is not their first language. They're adding 67 special education teachers' aides. So altogether, they're adding about $60 million in new spending to the budget, but they're only anticipating $23 million in new revenues. And so on paper, that might look like, how are they going to do that? And the answer is that the district has been anticipating this. And one thing they did when they got that big 1 year increase in state funding last year was they did not spend all of that money on recurring items. They actually took about $20 million in that new funding last year and used it to pay down debt, and used it to do one-time sorts of investments that were needed, but that also left that same amount of money now comes back this year, and it's not allocated to anything because they spent it on one-time things last year. So they have that money available. And then they've also identified, Ryswick actually asked all of his departments in the administration to propose 5% cuts for this year. Mostly not talking about cutting positions, but looking at ways to make themselves more efficient, look at kind of year over year spending that they usually put in their budget that maybe they don't need anymore. So all of that combined, they've identified about $38 million in savings and efficiencies. And so if you add that to that $23 million that they're anticipating in new funding, that gets you pretty quickly right to that approximately $60 million in new funding. There were some questions from a few members of the public who showed up. And if you want to see this presentation, by the way, it is up on the school system's YouTube channel at KCS TV. But a couple people asked questions. A few, schools, individual schools have already been informed what their funding and staff levels for next year are. And so there were some folks from Green Magnet Academy who were alarmed that they had heard that one of their dedicated STEM teaching positions was going to go away. Ryswick kind of explained that individual schools actually have a fair amount of leeway in deciding how they want to allocate their staffing. And so, he said in the case of Green Magnet Academy, for example, that yes, that one position as a line item went away, but the overall staffing for that school has actually gone up. And he said the principal of that school has the freedom to kind of figure out how to use those new positions, including to cover, the particular things that the parents were concerned about. So, overall, it looks like a fairly mundane, I guess you could say, school budget. We will see that the school board will be voting on the budget proposal at a special meeting on April 25th. And that will then go to County Mayor Glenn Jacobs to include in his overall county budget. Of course, schools make up, 60 to 65% of the total county budget. And all the school board can do is approve a proposed budget. The final funding has to actually be approved by county commissions. So we'll be going through that in the next few months. But overall, no big surprises here. We already knew about that salary schedule because the school board had already approved that, and we talked about that last week. I think the most interesting thing about this is the way the district has kind of massaged its funding over the last few years to set themselves up to make this big jump in salaries and benefits, even though the actual increase in funding they're going to see by itself wouldn't support that.
Well, the one thing that the TISA funding schedule or formula did was that big bump is basically raising the floor of the school board's budget, because that's recurring money. That's money that they're going to get every year. From moving forward, the annual increases will be smaller. Like you said, but 4% is pretty decent, anyway. But and by not spending it on recurring items last year, it enables them to start doing that this year. I guess one of the things is it's kind of like you win the lottery, but you don't run out and spend it right off the bat. You want to make sure that that money's really there and it's really going to be there forever, and then you can spend it, and that's what they did essentially.
Yep, and the Knox County Education Association, which represents teachers, has basically endorsed this plan as part of their whole. They have a collaborative conferencing effort that has kind of replaced. There were changes in state law about 10 years ago that modified how much power teachers unions have reduced how much power, let's say, teachers unions have in the state to negotiate with school systems, and they use this model called collaborative conferencing that is, about kind of reaching friendly agreement is the idea between the teachers unions and the school administration, and that has been working fairly convivially, I guess you could say. And Paula Hancock, who's the president of KCEA, said that they welcomed this new salary schedule and look forward to continuing to work with the administration on, negotiating their salary levels going forward. So, again, we'll see what individual school board members think of all this when they have that meeting on April 25th. But at the moment, there don't look to be any big red flags or flashpoints that's going to cause problems with either school board or county commission when it goes to them, because this is all based on what they anticipate to be existing revenues. They're not asking the county for, a tax increase or anything like that. All right, let's talk about the state legislature a little bit. There were a lot of interesting things went on in the legislature this week. As I said, we're toward the end of the session when things get real. Bills that are going to pass start passing, and bills that are not going to pass get sent out to pasture. We've talked in previous weeks about this age verification bill for social media platforms. That did pass the state Senate this past week. It had already been passed by the House, and that puts it in position to be signed by the governor if he hasn't already. I don't actually know. And that means that now I think we can anticipate some legal challenges to this. Laws like this have been challenged in other states by groups like the ACLU, who see them as an infringement on civil liberties. So we will see whether this bill actually takes effect next January 1st, but that is what it is set to do. And if it does, as we've talked about, it will mean that not only will minors, people under 18, need to have explicit parental consent to get onto any social media platform, whether that's, Twitter or Snapchat or TikTok. I'm not even going to say Facebook, because we all know that young people are not on Facebook. But if they do want to get on Facebook just to keep tabs on what their grandparents are doing or whatever, they will need parental consent for that as well. but also literally every single Tennessean who uses any social media platform will have to provide, personally identifying information to the platforms to verify our ages. So, for example, I have a Facebook account. I would need to verify my age to Facebook, even though I've been on Facebook since, 2008 or something. And I feel like this is still an underappreciated part of this law. This law was supported. It had bipartisan support. Most Democrats supported it in addition to most Republicans. But most of the discussion was about protecting children because that's the way the whole law is framed. And I am not at all persuaded that most Tennesseans understand what this law actually does and how actually intrusive it is going to be on literally every single adult user of any social media platforms in the state. And that's where the legal challenges are going to come, that this is an overly broad application of state power that actually interferes with individuals' freedom of expression, protected by the First Amendment. So we'll see how all that plays out. But just be aware, if you use and rely on social media platforms for anything, personal, professional, or otherwise, if this law does take effect, you are going to be handing over even more personal information than you already do to all of these Silicon Valley giants and trusting them to do right by your information. We'll see what happens. The other big bill that got attention this week was, and the state Senate has approved this as of right now. The state House has not. It is on their agenda for April 17th. So it could pass the House this coming week. But this is a bill that would allow school employees to carry concealed weapons at school, on school property during the school day. And this is one of these things that's been talked about in Tennessee before. It's been talked about in other states too, as one of many responses to concerns about school shootings and school security. We already have armed officers in all of our schools in Knox County. You have both school security officers and either Knox County Sheriff's officers or Knoxville Police Department officers assigned to our schools. So we already have people with guns in our schools every day. And everybody knows that they're there. They're dressed as officers, and they don't conceal their firearms. They're strapped right to their sides. You know that they're there. And they're
actually trained.
Uh-huh.
And they're actually trained.
And they are well trained. Police officers or school security officers. So this would create a new class of armed people in schools, which we wouldn't know they were armed. The law does require training. It says that in order to do this, a teacher or school employee, and it can be under the law any school employee. This includes custodians. It includes essentially anybody who works at a school under the law. Could apply to do this. They would have to complete 40 hours of training, which is the same training that school security officers have to go through. They would have to undergo a psychological examination and an FBI criminal background check. So a lot of steps and hoops to go through. And one thing that I wonder with this law is how many school employees are actually going to go to all that effort. They don't get paid anything extra to do this. They would have to undertake this at their own volition. And the other thing is that the law protects the school systems and the law enforcement agencies from any liability for a school employee's use or failure to use a handgun in any given situation. And so presumably that liability would be borne by the individual teacher. So in order to do this, you have to go through all this training. You have to submit a psychological exam and a criminal background check. And also, if anything bad happens, if you accidentally fire a gun in your classroom or do anything else that parents or students or anyone perceives as being dangerous to them, you would face liability for that without the protection that police and school security officers have, where the district and the county is going to come in on their behalf. So It seems like a pretty big burden to put on any individual school employee. So I guess the people who do this will be people who are very dedicated to it and just really want to be able to carry a gun with them at school. The law has some other interesting elements. It does put limits on where you could carry. So a teacher, for example, would be allowed to carry that weapon with them in the classroom, but not at school assemblies or school events, not at any meetings having to do with student discipline, not at any meetings having to do with, like if a teacher got in trouble with a principal and they were having some sort of disciplinary meeting, that teacher would not be allowed to bring a gun to that meeting, which is probably something that principals would be happy about. But the law doesn't say, like, what are those, like, let's say you have a teacher who has done this training and brings this gun with them to class. The gun is not allowed to be visible. They don't want to alarm students. So you would have to somehow carry this weapon in a way that would not be visible to the students in your classroom. And then if you suddenly have to take your class to a school assembly, you're not allowed to take the gun there. Where do you put the gun? The law doesn't say that. Like, are we going to have safe gun storage lockers in school classrooms? Let's say you store that gun somewhere while you go to one of these things that you're not allowed to bring the gun to, and you come back and the gun is missing. Who's responsible for that? The law is completely silent on that. So, and the other thing it does is it protects the confidentiality of anybody who because in order to do this, a teacher or school employee would have to get authorization from the superintendent and the school principal, and the local law enforcement agency also would need to know who in these schools is going armed. They would have that information, but the public is not allowed to have that information. The law makes that information confidential. And so you as a parent, me as a parent, I have a kid in Knox County Schools right now. I will have zero way of knowing and no legal avenue to find out if any of the teachers or staff members at my son's school are walking around armed next year. I'm not allowed to know that. And of course, as we pointed out in our coverage of this week, this is from the same legislature that just 2 years ago passed a transparency measure about classroom materials that required every teacher in the state to compile and put online a list of every single book in their classroom library, and make that searchable online to any parent and any citizen in the county and in the state. So this legislature is very concerned about parents being able to know what books are in their kids' classrooms, but also very concerned that parents not be allowed to find out who's carrying guns, who's carrying weapons. You cannot request, when you go to enroll your student at school, they're not going to ask you, do you want to be in an armed classroom or an unarmed classroom, or an armed school or an unarmed school. We're not going to have that information. There's all this talk about parents' rights from this legislature, but they seem very concerned about certain kinds of parents' rights. And when parents' rights conflict with Second Amendment rights, it's pretty clear where the actual emphasis of the legislature is, which is that, no, you can't know about that. So there's a lot of concern about this. Parents across the state have spoken out about it. This is one of those measures that there is no clear popular mandate for. There was a recent Vanderbilt University poll about school safety that among the findings, only 37% of parents statewide said they thought that arming school employees would make schools safer, which means that nearly 2/3 of parents did not think this was going to make schools safer. So essentially, nobody's really asking for this, and law enforcement agencies have spoken out against it. They don't necessarily love the idea of more people in schools having guns, but it has passed anyway, and I guess we'll see what happens.
Yeah, that's one thing that's always kind of puzzling about some of these things is that the law enforcement does speak out against, this law and others that do that, because there's this idea floating out there that it's a good guy with a gun can prevent crime and that sort of thing. Well, when a law enforcement officer goes to a scene and there is a gun visible, they don't know if that's a good guy or a bad guy. So they neutralize the threat, as they like to say, and by whatever means is necessary. And and that's one of these things that now, if God forbid there is a school shooting situation or a possible school shooting situation, and law enforcement responds, they don't know if they encounter a person with a weapon. They don't know if that's a teacher, a custodian, a cafeteria worker, or an angry or mentally disturbed person who's trying to kill kids. They don't know. So they're going to treat them all the same, which is not good.
Well, and there's also, the not unreasonable concern that even if you have an employee who's passed a psychological exam and doesn't have anything in their, doesn't have a criminal record or whatever and is qualified to do this, people get mad at work, right? And that includes in schools. Teachers can get mad. Custodians can get mad. Cafeteria workers can get mad. Anybody can, have a bad working relationship or a bad day or be going through a bad personal time. And in my view, it's not just that, maybe having somebody armed in a situation where somebody came from the outside as a shooter, even in that situation, having armed staff members creates complications, like you're saying, because police don't necessarily know. Like if there's two people shooting at each other in a classroom and the police show up, they're not necessarily going to know which one of those is the shooter and which one is the good guy, as you say. But also, those school employees themselves we have workplace shootings in this country relatively commonly, and we have a history in this district. Back, I forget how many years, 12, 15 years ago, there was a teacher at one of our elementary schools who got crosswise with their school administration, and they were being reprimanded and disciplined. And that teacher went out to their car where they had a gun, brought it back in, and shot two administrators who thankfully survived. But, I think just any situation where you're broadening the pool of people who have guns. I think about my own, say, high school teachers. I can imagine a couple of my high school teachers wanting to bring guns to school, and they are not teachers who I would have wanted as a student to have guns in school with them. It would have raised a lot of concerns for me to have a couple of my teachers armed because, look, teachers are people like everybody else, and there's a range of personality types. It raises a whole lot of questions. Very unclear. There's literally no data on any of this because this isn't something that most states do. So there's no data to know whether this actually increases school safety in any way or creates some kind of deterrent because, people aren't going to go and shoot up schools now because teachers might have guns. Well, people go and shoot up schools now knowing that there are already armed security guards in there. So the prospect of a kindergarten teacher or a cafeteria worker or whoever having a gun, who knows? I don't know that we can anticipate the mindset of somebody who wants to go shoot up a school, but very unclear whether that actually has any real deterrent or protective powers. Nevertheless, we live in a state that has gone from being Second Amendment friendly to something beyond that. I don't know what the next stage is beyond being friendly to the Second Amendment. We are not yet to the point where everybody's being required to carry a gun. But it's a little hard to see where the end point to all of this is. I would have thought a few years ago that they had sort of loosened up gun laws just about as much as possible in this state. But every year they come back and there has to be some new way to show their deference to the Second Amendment. The other bill that's moving through the legislature right now would allow open carry. Of course, we're talking about concealed carry here, would allow open carry of weapons by anyone down to the age of 18. And so somebody out there thinks that what we need to make this state more safe is 18-year-olds walking around with AR-15s in the park or the mall parking lot or whatever, because we all know what great judges of, character and action and everything else 18-year-olds are, and that this is also supposedly going to make us more safe. I don't know how many people are going to feel more safe if they go to the park and there's an 18-year-old kid walking around with an AR-15. But we may get to find out. These are the things we get to find out in Tennessee.
Even if it's on an AR-15, even if it's a Glock, a millimeter, they're all deadly. So,
yeah. Okay, let's talk about Justice Knox, and this is going to set up our interview that we have with the Reverend Dr. Jacquelyn Bragg, who's co-president of Justice Knox. But Scott, Justice Knox is an interesting group. They've been around for about 8 years, and it's an interdenominational group of local congregations. What are they up to?
Well, yes, it's an association of congregations that is dedicated to addressing social justice issues, and they are very effective in doing that. And one of the things that they do is they hold what they call the Nehemiah Action Assembly every year, where they have it at the Civic Auditorium. This is what they did last week. The organization brings in public officials. They ask them to take action on various issues, and those officials either say yes they will or no they won't. And it's kind of funny because they do just give them yes or no questions. But they've been very effective. They were very involved in getting the city to create the Affordable Housing Fund, which by ordinance the city has to spend at least $5 million a year on affordable housing out of local dollars for a 10-year period. We're in year 3 now, so I think next year will be the 4th year. This year they addressed that again. They asked Mayor Buchanan to extend that beyond the original 10-year time frame, and she agreed to try to find a way to do that. But the main issue that they've been working on in the last year or so has been the things that they did. Both mayors did just recently, and as an outgrowth of that, they are asking that the Joint Office of Housing Stability, which is coming up with a strategic plan to address homelessness, that they make it a goal to get to net functional zero homelessness for a particular population. Now, net zero homelessness, as Reverend Bragg will point out, is kind of where you have more people leaving homelessness than you have falling into homelessness, and so they agreed to do that. They agreed to bring Knox Justice Knox in as a stakeholder, an official stakeholder in developing that plan. They also got a commitment from 3 school board members, at least, to continue to advocate for publishing discipline data. And so, it was an interesting organization. They actually don't blindside officials at these meetings. They work with them to develop these ideas, and this is kind of almost a choreographed show, but it is effective and draws attention to some of these issues.
All right. Well, to talk about all of that, we have asked one of the co-presidents of Justice Knox to join us and go into both what their efforts are this year and some of the issues that they want to address in future years. So let's go ahead and go to that interview.
Our guest this week is Reverend Dr. Jacquelyn Bragg. She is Associate Pastor at Mount Olive Baptist Church in East Knoxville, and she's also the co-president of Justice Knox. And welcome to Compass Points.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here with you.
What the first thing right off the bat is tell our readers or listeners a little bit about what Justice Knox is and what you do.
Well, Justice Knox is a conglomeration in Knoxville of 23 different congregations from different denominations. And what we do is in obedience to the biblical mandate to do justice. The Bible says in Micah 6:8 that God requires us to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And so our focus is that first one, to do justice.
All right. And every year you have the Nehemiah Action Assembly, which this concluded last week. And tell us what you like to do at the assembly. What is the centerpiece of the assembly?
Well, the centerpiece of the assembly is to confront and ask the cooperation of our elected officials and other groups in the community to solve problems that impact many people, if not all people, in the community in which we live.
Well, and this last week you had three main requests of the elected officials. Go through those real quickly and what you wanted them to commit to doing and why.
Okay, well, our main focus of one of our issues was homelessness. And so our ask of Aaron Reed, the executive director of the Knox County Office of Housing Stability, was to include Justice Knox as stakeholders as the development of the 5-year strategic plan progresses. And she said yes. We asked her also to report at our next annual assembly about the progress of that 5-year plan. And to that, she also said yes. We asked both Mayor Kincannon and Mayor Jacobs to agree to encourage the development of that strategic plan and to identify at least one vulnerable population that we would start with initially, to be followed by other identifications of vulnerable populations. Both of them said yes to that ask. We also asked both of them to agree to support a consulting contract with Julia Orlando, who was the special expert who we had in Knoxville on March the 20th, to talk to 100 officials in the community and service providers to find out just how in Philadelphia she was leading to plan to get that community to what is called functional zero. And that's where more people are leaving your homelessness system than are being entered into it. And they are leaving because they have permanent housing with the wraparound services that ensure their success. And they said yes to that contract agreement. Now, for Mayor Kincannon herself, we asked her this question: would she work with Justice Knox to develop a dedicated funding source to expand the current housing trust that is set to expire in 10 years, so that when we work together, that we will have a funding source addressing homelessness that goes beyond that 10 years, essentially no matter who the leadership is in that mayoral seat. And to that, she said yes. We asked Mayor Jacobs himself if he would say yes to a partnership with Justice Knox to identify resources to support the plan that leads to affordable housing as far as the county is concerned. And he said yes, that he would also work with us to identify funding resources that currently are not in place.
All right. One of the things is he said they all said yes, so that was a big success for Justice Knox. And the organization's been really successful in recent years in persuading government officials to act to make some changes in the community. How has Justice Knox been able to do that when a lot of other social justice organizations and individuals who advocate for social justice sometimes don't get as much traction?
Well, we actually have a very democratic process that we start each fall. And so in our 23 churches, there are several justice ministry teams, and each of those teams invites 8 to 10 people to what we call a house meeting. Some of those house meetings are in person. Some of them are on Zoom. And we start with a couple of general questions. We ask people what concerns them and what keeps them up at night. And then we listen to their stories. Then we come together, all 23 churches, and we share the topics of those stories. And then we democratically vote on the issue or the issues that we will research as the year progresses. And we do diligent research locally and nationally, and we visit. We also meet with experts, kind of like Julia Orlando, who have done the things that we are seeking to do. And when the research is done, we hopefully, and most times, are able to present some real solutions to the problems. And we do not blindside our officials. We meet with them during the research process. We let them know where we are and what solutions are beginning to look like, and of course, what the resources are that will be needed to make those solutions realities in our community. And then it is finally at the Nehemiah Action that is in the spring that we ask them what they knew we were going to ask them. And we don't always know that they're going to say yes, but they do always know what we are going to ask. And so that is what happened this time as well.
And can you talk? Scott mentioned that you've had success in other issues in other years before this. Could you talk a little bit about some of the issues you have worked on in prior years? I know affordable housing, for example, is one of them. But what's the kind of matrix of needs that you all have tried to tackle so far?
Well, we are going on our third year, and this is still an ongoing issue, but when we had the house meetings a couple of years ago, people were really concerned about deaths by gun violence. And so we researched that issue. And long story short, we got the mayor, Mayor Kincannon, on board. She was a wonderful partner. We had a problem analysis done by a reputable criminal justice organization. And they told us not only where, the gun violence was happening in Knoxville, but the ages of the people and the demographics that were perpetuating, this terrible thing. And so we knew then what had to be done. And so she was instrumental in helping put a pilot together to see just how it might work. And so that has led to what we have now, which is the Office of Community Safety and Neighborhoods led by LaKenya Middlebrook. And it's a partnership with law enforcement, with the district attorney's office, and with social services agencies like Helen Ross McNabb. And of course, an important part of that is the personnel in the form of Denzel Grant, who's the executive director of Turn Up Knox, and they are violence interrupters. When shootings occur, Denzel and his team are first after law enforcement, sometimes before, because they have ongoing relationships with some of the folks who are most likely to, be involved in these things. And so they're on the scene, they're at the hospital, and then they're following up with families to see if there are some services that we can help them access that will either lessen this or eventually put a stop to the loss of life by gun violence.
One thing that you mentioned, there was mentioned at the assembly was that, and other things that had happened in the past that you all were continuing to follow. It seems like that's more of a form of accountability, that you don't just call for officials to say things and make promises, but then you also follow up to report to your membership, how they're keeping their promises.
Absolutely. So I mentioned at the Nehemiah Assembly that our initial goal that we set beginning at 2022 was to reduce violent deaths by guns to 10% annually, and the same for non-violent, non-fatal gun shootings. And so to date, at that time, at the end of 2023, instead of having that goal met of 10%, our goal was lessened, and we had lessened gun violence deaths by 33% and non-fatal deaths by 12%. But in the most recent numbers, the non-fatal gun shootings are down 58%. And we will be looking at the numbers for the fatal shootings as the year progresses.
And can you talk a little bit about, because I think one of the things that's most interesting about Justice Knox is that you've been able to, as you say, you're in your eighth year, you've been able to keep this initiative together with all of these different congregations, and there's been some turnover in organizational leadership, and probably some of those congregations have had turnover in leadership too, I'm just guessing. How do you maintain that from year to year and kind of keep that steady presence and that steady pressure that you all do?
Well, we're non-political for one thing, and ours is for the good of the whole community, which involves all races and classes and neighborhoods. And there's probably not a demographic that's not impacted one way or the other. And so this is everybody needs to be involved. And so we do keep people informed. They know what we're doing and where we're progressing and, where we need help. And there's not a time that people don't know. We meet regularly. We have a board, of course, made up of, representatives from our congregations. And so the communication is ongoing. It's open. People are welcome to come and be a part of the things that we're doing, our meetings. So there's no secret society or anything like that. It's for the good of the whole community.
Yeah, and how important is it to get that collaboration? You mentioned the collaboration with the public officials. You mentioned Mayor Concannon working with you on the gun violence side. How important is it to get that collaboration from them, even though they might be resistant early on to what you all are seeking?
I think one of the things that works is the officials, especially that we are working with, don't always have the time and the resources to do the research so that they would make an informed decision. And so we do that and share it with them. We also do things like bring in consultants like we did Julia Orlando in terms of homelessness. And we got everybody in the room, not just elected officials, but social service providers, educators, healthcare, everybody that had a little piece and seems to be doing their own thing, but not in a comprehensive way that's going to make a difference permanently. And so that was just major. And people were so excited and inspired. And so the work is beginning. And I think that's the difference, is when people collaborate, it's a better use of resources and time and information. And of course, important relationships continue to be formed and bonded for the greater good.
Are you all still open to it? Like if somebody was listening to this and thinking, oh, maybe my church might want to be involved in this. Are you still open to other people coming into the fold?
Absolutely. The more, the better. Can you imagine what other kind of issues we could take on in research if we had more hands on deck? That would be awesome. Yes.
What's the best way for people to get information?
Well, we do have a website, so they can go on the website and look at all of our contact information on Justice Knox.
All right, and one other thing that would like to get you to address is recurring word that happened during the meeting last week was neighbor.
Yes.
That seemed to be a real point of emphasis and emphasizing that that we're all neighbors. Talk a little bit about that sense of being someone's neighbor and what responsibility that brings.
Well, I think that we started by reminding people that from, our biblical source, from beginning to end, it's about relationship. God started with relationship with man, and that was so that men could be in relationship with other men, and that's men, women, children, so that it's not a separation by class or race or gender or anything like that. It's one race, and it's the human race, and we all have a responsibility to care for each other. And when we separate into these silos, then resources get inequitably distributed. And of course, some people are without and some people have more than enough. And that is not a good way for a community to survive and thrive. And so that's our beginning basis.
All right. Well, that's probably a good way to wrap up, except I'll just ask you, do you have any sense of what future issues are out there that you all maybe haven't had the time or focus for yet, but that are on the horizon that you would like to get to? Or will those wait for that next round of those House meetings you're talking about?
Well, in addition to homelessness and education, those are going to be ongoing for a while. And so, we're especially pleased that the school board members, Bite, Butler, and Watson were there. And what we asked of them is that they would encourage the district. Of course, they're not in a position to mandate it, but to encourage the district to share with us the discipline data twice annually as the district has agreed. And we are pleased that the assistant superintendent has agreed to meet with with us. And also the announcement that additional monies were made available to expand the responsive practices to a sixth school in Knox County. And so we're encouraged that education is going to be more equitable for all students in all districts. But it's, as you say, we won't know what the next new issues are until we have House meetings, but we do have one on the table that is still in research, and that's economic instability. And what we found this year is there were a lot of facets to economic instability, and one of them was childcare, transportation, and this disconnect between what industries say they need and the skills and availability for training that people do or do not have. And so we have decided to take that in parts. And so one of the parts we're going to look at first is how fees and fines, that have to do with people who've been to court, impact people's availability to get employment, which impacts their availability to get housing and like that. And so that will be ongoing, as well as these things that we already have in the works.
All right, great. Well, you sure don't pick easy ones, do you?
It's about saving people's lives, and that is serious business.
Right. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we will certainly continue to track what you all are doing in the community.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Scott.
All right. And thanks again to Reverend Dr. Bragg for joining us. We will, of course, continue to cover Justice Knox as they continue their work. Just a quick technical note. I know there were some audio issues right before we introduced that interview. Apologies. We do not control the internet. We are all dependent on this technology. But hopefully the interview itself covered everything that was talked about there. So anything you missed during those little gaps was made up for in the interview.
Well, the good thing about the audio difficulties was that it happened while I was talking. So they really didn't miss a whole lot. So, yeah, we can't control what goes out over the internet, or what the internet picks up and what it doesn't pick up. So
sometimes the hamsters on the wheels get a little tired, and
yeah.
All right. Well, let's look ahead to this coming week. We do have a couple of meetings. Knox County Commission will have its monthly work session on Monday at 5 p.m. in the main assembly room of the City County building. And among the items on the agenda is the comprehensive land use plan, which, as we talked about earlier, in order for these changes to the county's land use planning to be done, they first had to approve the growth policy plan. Now that that has been done and Farragut has signed off on it, County Commission can go ahead and consider this fairly significant overhaul of county planning, which we have written about and talked about as that plan moved through Planning Commission. County Commission had a work session on it last month, so you can find coverage of that if you're looking for some background on our website. And County Commission will probably talk about it more at this work session ahead of then voting on it at the next Monday's monthly voting meeting. And then Scott, City Council has a regular meeting scheduled for Tuesday.
Yeah, they do, and they're doing a couple of interesting things. One is they are transferring the ownership of the McClung warehouse site to KCDC in anticipation of issuing a request for proposals to get a developer to build something there. It's been almost, you can almost say that's been the holy grail of downtown redevelopment for the last 20 years, because when the warehouses still stood, they were seen by many as being full of potential for historic preservation. Then, of course, they burned down a series of 2 fires over several years. But now it's a large, highly visible from Interstate 40 site that could house just about anything. It's a block from Gay Street. It's 3 blocks from the old city. It's short distance to the core of downtown. It's just very could be a very popular thing. I would imagine there will be several proposals that would come forward. But anyway, the one thing they have to do to get before they can do that is get it in the ownership of KCDC. That's what they're going to be doing. They are also transferring $20 million to KCDC. That is the pool of money from a state grant for the construction of a pedestrian bridge. If they also get federal funding, but they're going to go ahead and KCDC is going to be would be in charge of that project if it moves forward, and so they're going to go ahead and give them that money too. So those are kind of the 2 big things that they're going to be doing on Tuesday.
All right, and just to be clear, just in case that audio was a little blurry, we're talking about KCDC here, not ACDC. City of Knoxville is not preparing to transfer property or funds to the Australian rock band. Sorry if anybody's excited. Huh?
That'd be kind of fun.
Yeah. Well, they could put in a proposal, I suppose, if they wanted to.
No, but this is Knoxville's Community Development Corporation. So.
Right. Got it. All right. Well, I think that covers us for this week. Thanks, as always, to Lord Seth Barber for his production work, especially when we have to do these remote episodes. He has to handle things there from the production desk. We appreciate that. Our theme music is by Will Wright. We will be back next week to talk about anything that happens between now and then. And now I am going to go to the French Quarter and see what's going on. I may or may not come back. We'll see.
You better.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost in Agreement. Almost in Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostinagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.